Welcome to your personalized deep dive. Today, we're going deep beneath the surface. No scuba gear required, though, thankfully. We're going to explore the fascinating world of soft tissue injuries.
That's right. Get ready to uncover the surprising complexity of these everyday injuries, from those minor scrapes we've all had to more serious wounds, and most importantly, what you can actually do about them.
I'm all about being prepared, so let's dive in. And where better to start than with the body's own suit of armor, our skin.
It really is an incredible organ, our largest, in fact, and often overlooked until something goes wrong, right?
Largest organ.
Yeah.
Okay, you've got my attention. I have to admit, I don't often think of my skin as an organ. Break it down for me. Why is this seemingly simple layer so crucial?
Well, think of your skin as this dynamic, multi-layered barrier that's constantly working to protect you. You've got the tough epidermis on the outside, acting like the frontline defense, but then you have the dermis underneath, this bustling network of blood vessels, nerves, sweat glands. It's a whole world down there.
And all of that is working to keep the bad stuff out and the good stuff in, right?
Exactly. Your skin regulates your temperature, prevents dehydration, fights off infection. It's the definition of unsung hero, which is why even a small break can have big consequences if it's not taken care of properly.
So with all that in mind, how do different types of injuries actually happen to this incredible organ? What's the difference between, say, a nasty bruise and a deep cut?
It really boils down to the force involved
Yeah.
and whether it's blunt or penetrating. Imagine tripping and falling onto a hard surface. Oof, that's blunt force trauma. And it might cause a contusion, better known as a bruise.
I've certainly had my fair share of those, unfortunately.
So with a contusion, the skin's intact, but those underlying blood vessels get damaged, leading to that colorful discoloration.
And as someone who bruises like a peach, I can attest to the colorful part. But if that's blunt force, what about a sharp object? Like if you were to, say, accidentally slice yourself with a kitchen knife while chopping veggies.
Ouch, yeah. That's a perfect example of a penetrating injury. Instead of just bruising, you're actually breaking the skin's barrier, creating an open wound. And depending on the depth and force, you could be looking at damage to muscles, tendons, or even major blood vessels. Yikes.
So basically two very different forces, two very different ways the body responds. But what about crushing injuries? Those sound terrifying. What makes them so different?
Crush injuries are a whole other ballgame. Think of a heavy object falling on a limb or someone getting pinned between two surfaces.
Okay, yeah, those are definitely next level.
Right. The danger with crush injuries isn't just the immediate damage, but the prolonged, intense pressure. It's like holding your breath for way too long, but for your tissues. The blood flow gets restricted, and that can lead to something called compartment syndrome.
Compartment syndrome. That sounds ominous. Tell me more.
So imagine a garden hose with a kink in it.
Yeah.
The water can't flow through properly, right? Compartment syndrome is similar, but instead of a hose, it's the fascia, the tough membrane surrounding your muscles, that gets constricted.
So the pressure builds up because the blood flow is cut off.
Exactly. And that pressure can damage those muscles and nerves within that compartment, sometimes permanently.
Wow. So even if a crush injury doesn't look that bad on the surface, there could be a lot more going on underneath. It's like a silent threat.
That's why a thorough assessment is crucial with any injury, but especially closed ones where the full extent of the damage might not be immediately visible.
So we've delved into those closed injuries where what you see isn't always what you get. But now let's talk about those injuries that are a bit more in your face. Open wounds. Yikes.
Open wounds are, yeah, they're definitely a different beast altogether. We're talking about a literal break in the skin barrier, which, as you can imagine, opens the door to bleeding and infection. And just like with closed injuries, there's a whole spectrum of severity and different types with their own unique characteristics.
Spectrum of severity, different types. I'm sensing a pattern here.
Right.
All right, so walk me through this spectrum. What's the most, everyday type of open wound we might encounter?
Well, let's start with the humble abrasion. You know, your everyday scrapes, road rash, rug burn, those pesky little injuries that just seem to pop up out of nowhere.
Ouch. Yeah. I can relate to those.
Yeah.
Even though they're usually pretty shallow, they can be surprisingly painful. Why is that?
It all comes down to those nerve endings. They're highly concentrated in the epidermis, that top layer of skin, so even a minor scrape is setting off a chorus of ouch signals from those exposed nerves.
That explains a lot. So if those everyday scrapes or abrasions, what about a deeper cut? Is that where lacerations come in?
Exactly. A laceration is a cut, but usually we're talking something a bit more jagged, a bit more irregular. Think of a fall on a sharp edge or something tearing the skin. And because they can be deeper than abrasions, lacerations have the potential to damage underlying structures like blood vessels, muscles, and even tendons.
Okay, those are definitely the ones where bleeding becomes a major concern, right?
Right. Absolutely. Controlling bleeding is a top priority with any open wound, but especially lacerations, because they can involve larger blood vessels. And of course, with that break in the skin, the risk of infection is also a major concern.
Infection, the invisible enemy. So what about avulsions? Those sound intense. Is that when you have a flap of skin torn away?
You got it. Imagine a scenario where a portion of skin gets, like, ripped away from the body. That's an avulsion. It could be anything from a dog bite to a ring getting caught on something and ouch, just tearing the skin.
Okay. Now those sound incredibly painful, and I imagine the bleeding must be significant.
They certainly can be, and controlling bleeding is crucial, of course. And with avulsions, there's the added element of trying to preserve the torn flap of skin if at all possible.
Preserve it. What do you mean, like try to reattach it?
In some cases, yes. If the avulsed tissue is relatively clean and the wound is fresh, there's a chance it can be surgically reattached. But even if reattachment isn't possible, preserving the tissue is still important because it might be used for grafting later on.
Wow. So even in those extreme situations, there's still a focus on trying to salvage as much as possible. That's pretty amazing.
The human body has an incredible capacity for healing. But speaking of extreme situations, we can't forget about amputations.
Amputations, those are the ones that really make you realize how fragile our bodies can be.
They are a stark reminder, for sure. And while they might seem like a world away from your everyday scrape or cut, the basic principles of first aid still apply. You know, control the bleeding, protect the wound from further contamination, and get to definitive medical care as quickly as possible.
Okay, we've covered quite a bit of ground here, from those everyday abrasions to the more extreme avulsions and amputations. But what about those injuries that are less about force and more about, well, sneaky intrusions? I'm talking about puncture wounds.
Puncture wounds definitely deserve their own category. They might not always look as dramatic as like a gaping laceration, but don't let that fool you.
I've always been a bit wary of puncture wounds, even those seemingly minor ones like stepping on a nail. It seems so common, yet I know it can be riskier than it looks.
You're right to be cautious that small entry point can be deceiving because whatever caused the puncture, be it a nail, a piece of glass, even a thorn could be harboring all sorts of bacteria.
So that tiny puncture is like a backdoor for infection to sneak in.
Precisely. And not only that, but the object might have penetrated deeper than you realize, potentially damaging underlying structures.
That makes sense. So if we find ourselves dealing with a puncture wound, what's the most important thing to remember?
First and foremost, don't try to remove the impaled object if there is one. I know it's tempting, but that object might actually be helping to control the bleeding.
It's like a built-in bandage in a way.
Exactly. The best course of action is to control any bleeding by applying pressure around the object, not directly on it. Keep the area clean and get to a medical professional as soon as possible.
Control, contain, and transport seem to be a recurring theme in the world of wound care.
It's a good mantra to remember. Now, speaking of sneaky injuries and unwanted intrusions, we have to talk about bites.
Bites, I'm guessing those fall into the puncture wound with a site of infection category.
You could say that we tend to focus on animal bites, which are definitely a concern because of rabies, although it is relatively rare these days.
So even a small animal bite should be taken seriously.
Absolutely. Even if rabies isn't a concern, animal bites by their very nature introduce a significant amount of bacteria into the wound, making infection much more likely.
Okay, that's good to know. So basically treat it like any other puncture wound, but with an extra dose of caution.
Exactly. Thorough cleaning and disinfection are essential, and don't forget about human bites.
Human bites, those can't be that common or serious, right?
You might be surprised human bites, even those that seem minor, carry a very high risk of infection because of the types of bacteria present in our mouths.
That's wild. I never would have thought a nip from another person would be something to really worry about. Okay, we've covered quite a range of injuries caused by blunt force, sharp objects, even our own teeth. But what about injuries caused by a different kind of force altogether? Heat. Let's talk burns.
Burns are complex and can range from those minor kitchen mishaps to severe injuries requiring specialized care, but at their core, they fall under the umbrella of soft tissue injuries because they involve damage to the skin and underlying tissues.
And we're not just talking fire here, right? There are chemical burns, electrical burns, the list goes on.
You're absolutely right. Different sources of heat cause different types of burns, each with its own set of characteristics and treatment considerations.
So regardless of the source, what are the key things to keep in mind when dealing with burns?
The first priority is always to stop the burning process, whether that's extinguishing a flame, removing a chemical, or breaking contact with an electrical source.
Safety first for both the person injured and anyone providing help.
Exactly. Once the source of the burn is addressed, the next step is to assess the severity, and there are specific methods for doing that, like the rule of nines and the rule of palm.
Okay, I've heard those terms before, but could you break down what they actually mean?
Of course, the rule of nines is a quick way to estimate the percentage of body surface area affected by a burn. It divides the body into sections, each representing 9% or multiples of 9% of the total body surface area for adults. Each arm is about 9%. The front of the torso is 18%. Each leg is 18%, and so on. It helps give a quick estimate of how extensive the burn is.
So if someone burns their entire arm, that would be about 9% using the rule of nines. And what about the rule of palm? What's that all about?
The rule of palm is helpful for smaller burns.
Yeah.
Basically, the surface area of the palm of the person's hand is roughly equivalent to 1% of their total body surface area, so you can use their hand as a guide to estimate the size of a smaller burn.
That's actually really helpful, especially in those moments when you need to make a quick assessment. So once you've determined the severity, what are the next steps in treating a burn?
For minor burns, cooling the area with cool, not cold water can help soothe the pain and minimize tissue damage. But for more severe burns, especially those covering a larger area, it's crucial to seek immediate medical attention. And one often overlooked type of burn is an inhalation burn, which occurs when someone inhales hot smoke or fumes.
Inhalation burns, those sound especially dangerous.
They can be because they affect the airway. They can quickly become life-threatening. Signs of an inhalation burn include coughing difficulty, breathing slit around the nostrils, or singed facial hair.
Okay, so if you suspect someone might have an inhalation burn, it's 911 time, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Always err on the side of caution, especially when it comes to burns and potential airway involvement.
That's really important advice. Now, we've talked a lot about what to do in these situations, but what about what not to do? Are there any common first aid myths or misconceptions we should address?
One common misconception is the idea of putting butter or ice on a burn. Please don't do that. Butter can actually trap heat and worsen the injury, and ice can further damage the skin. Cool water is the way to go for minor burns, and for more serious burns, medical attention is crucial.
So cool water, not an ice bath, and definitely no butter. Good to know any other myths we need to bust.
Another common mistake is peeling off clothing that's stuck to a burn, as tempting as it might be. It can actually cause more harm than good if clothing is stuck. It's best to leave it in place and let the medical professionals handle it.
Got it. Don't try to play surgeon at home. Let the professionals handle the complex stuff. This entire deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. I feel like I've learned so much about the intricacies of soft tissue injuries.
Knowledge is power, and understanding of these injuries, recognizing the warning signs, and knowing the appropriate first aid steps can make all the difference in an emergency.
It's about being prepared, not panicked. Knowing that you have the knowledge to act quickly and confidently can bring a sense of calm to what might otherwise be a chaotic situation.
Well said, and sometimes that calm action can make a life-saving difference.
So true. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the protective power of our skin to those unexpected dangers lurking in seemingly minor injuries. It's a good reminder that even in the most ordinary moments, it's worth being prepared for the unexpected. So as you go about your day, remember those key takeaways. Stay curious and stay safe out there.